Good afternoon, colleagues. I think we'll get started now. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. This is the 15th webinar in our 28 for 28 series on the road to COP28 today. Today's webinar brings together experts to discuss synergies between disaster risk reduction and climate action. The data is clear that climate change has led to a rise in the severity and frequency of climate-related disasters, especially in the most vulnerable communities. We all know that repeated climate-induced disasters leads to food and water insecurities. It impacts livelihoods. It results in disrupted schooling and all sorts of other consequences. Linking climate and disaster risk reduction in integrated planning and risk management is essential, and today's experts will be reflecting on this. I'd like to hand over first to the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, the head of the office in Bonn, Mr. Animesh Kumar, to give our lead presentation. Thank you, Animesh.
Thank you, Katherine, and hello, colleagues, everyone as well. I'm speaking from Bonn today, and in my presentation today, I would be trying to make a strong case of how disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation and other elements of climate action go together hand in hand, and the artificial silos that often we have created over decades of work actually work as an impediment to resilience building. So in my presentation, I would initially talk about different elements of climate action and how they can work or are working in synergy with disaster risk reduction, and then with a very specific focus on the COP28 key priority expectations on how this can be further strengthened. So in context of let me set the stage in terms of the overall context. So we already know that we are not on track in terms of reaching the 1.5 degree target as set by the Paris Agreement. A lot of efforts are being made, including through a just transition in energy and so on, but we are still not there. And it's already very clear, and if you look at the IPCC reports, working group 1 and 2 and 3 as well, we'll see that the emission gaps remain too wide as of now. And we have already reached 1.1 degrees of warming, which is leading to increase in severity of disasters with increase in frequency. Different places otherwise not facing certain specific set of events are now facing them. And more importantly, the risks coming from climate change are becoming much more severe, more complex, occurring simultaneously in different parts and increasing in their frequency and intensity. The compounding and dual nature of risks is often becoming a key challenge for all of us to manage, and overwhelming the capacities of disaster managers, as well as in terms of inserting the adaptive capacity into communities. It also is very clear that there will always be limits to the point that we can adapt, because if the planet continues to warm, then adaptation will no longer be an option. And this is something which has been very much emphasized in the IPCC synthesis report as well. At the same time, the flip side of all of it is that risk-blind planning processes often create new risk for the future. And one fallout of this process is maladaptation. Again, the working group 2 had talked about how we have enhanced evidence as of now across sectors and communities that risk-blind processes often create maladaptation processes, and hence it actually is becoming much more and more evident. All of this points to the fact that while we need to continue and strengthen our efforts to narrow the emission gaps and strengthen mitigation ambition, we also need to be ready to face a world warmer than 1.5. And this is what brings in disaster risk reduction as a key element for climate action. Seems my screen is not working. Let me try to share it again. Okay, So one of the key things that we should also be looking at would be in context of how disaster risk reduction and climate action overlap. Many of us may have already seen this so-called the Venn diagram that we often present as a basis to understand how disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation actually interact with each other. There are specific nuances to disaster risk reduction, specific nuances to climate change adaptation, but there is a huge area of intersection between the two, which is in context of reducing and managing disaster and disaster risks. But this conventional Venn diagram approach of looking at the specific nuances of climate action and disaster risk reduction, and then looking at the intersection is also being questioned because we are increasingly realizing that they essentially are this more or less the same in terms of their approaches, in terms of the information systems that they use, and the overall outcomes that adaptation and risk reduction aim at achieving. If that be the case, we should not be actually trying to look at how integrating one into the other, but essentially following a comprehensive approach towards integrated implementation. And this is something which I'll come to in my subsequent slides. We should also look at the overall picture of the key guiding documents, for example, the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework. Under Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, the aims of the agreement itself were outlined. And if you even do a cursory remark of the aims of the Paris Agreement under Article 2 and look at then again against the Sendai Framework goal, you will see that there is a huge resonance in terms of the goals and the ambitions of the two specific frameworks and agreements. So what are the key elements? And now I'm trying to get closer to the COP28 key agenda items and priorities that are expected to be discussed before, in preparation of, and at the COP28. So one of the key expected outcomes at the COP28 will be the global stocktake. I'm very happy to inform that just yesterday I've come back from New York, where last week the high-level meeting of the midterm review of the Sendai Framework was adopted. This has been done through a consultative negotiation process through the governments. And now at the 7 years down the line of implementation of the Sendai Framework, we have taken stock of where we are in terms of the implementation and what are the corrective actions that can be taken in the remaining duration of the Sendai Framework. You would see the traffic light approach that we have adopted in terms of looking at the performance of the Sendai Framework vis-a-vis the seven targets that were adopted to measure its progress. We have done reasonably well in terms of containing disaster-related mortality and enhancing governance mechanism through strategies across countries. 126 countries have developed a disaster risk reduction strategy by now, but we haven't done well enough in context of reducing the number of affected population, economic losses, and damages to infrastructure and service disruption. And we are progressing, but not with the speed which we wanted for financing and early warning systems. So that's the current status of Sendai Framework. Now, this result of the Sendai Framework midterm review is a key opportunity to align itself with the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement, considering they're happening concurrently. And the outcomes of the midterm review of the Sendai Framework will form a key input, should form a key input into the global stocktake. And this has been something which would also be discussed at the upcoming subsidiary bodies meeting here in Bonn. Our core message here in context of the outcomes of the midterm review and in context of the global stocktake is that the progress in climate action should also be measured against the reduction of losses and damages, and the matrix, data and standards that the Sendai Framework offers are some of the key resources that should be considered in the measurement of the performance of the Paris Agreement. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, that the silos between climate action and disaster risk reduction should be questioned, and we should be able to follow a comprehensive risk management approach towards adaptive governance. The other element of discussion in context of COP28 is Article 7, which established the global goal on adaptation. Many of us are already part of this discussion. The next workshop on GGA will take place here in Bonn and also hybrid on 4th and 5th of June. Now, the key interfaces on the GGA vis-a-vis disaster risk reduction is the very fact that the targets of, or the overall adaptation target of GGA under Article 7 talks about enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. And if you go back to the slide that I had presented earlier in context of the goal of the Sendai framework, you'll see that the goal of the adaptation and goal of the Sendai framework, again, are very much in synergy. If that be the case, we definitely expect that the monitoring mechanisms of the Sendai framework will help shape and structure the GGA moving forward at the global level, but also at the national level, with the NAPS being the implementation planning document for adaptation planning and implementation in countries, and can also benefit from the disaster risk reduction plans that are in the same country. Over time, following on good practices of the integrated plans in the Pacific, we would encourage more and more countries to follow an approach where there is synergy in implementation at the national level as well as at the local level. So this is a strong case that we have been trying to put forward, that the matrix, targets, indicators, data of Sendai framework have gone through an intergovernmental negotiation process, have been endorsed through a UN General Assembly resolution, and if that be the case, should be a very key input into the GGA negotiation process. Similarly, as I mentioned, in terms of the adaptation planning processes in the countries, we definitely see the guidance, the documents which are existing under and being used by the countries to also be used in terms of the national adaptation planning. And this is one of the key initiatives that UNDRR has been leading on. Now, loss and damage is another key agenda item that is being discussed. As we speak, the second transitional committee of the Loss and Damage Fund will kickstart tomorrow here in Bonn. And one of the key instances that we do see here is loss and damage being a key entry point for disaster risk reduction. Indeed, if you look at the 3 core actions on loss and damage, whether it's about averting or minimizing or addressing loss and damage, you will see that there is a very strong resonance in terms of the existing DRR actions that can be mapped to averting, minimizing, or addressing loss and damage. Again, if there is a clear resonance in terms of DRR actions being able to map with loss and damage action, then we should indeed ensure that risk management becomes a key basis for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, which is also being considered in the context of different loss and damage funding discussions. So what is UNDRR doing about all of this? We, as a convener of disaster risk reduction, as the focal point for DRR in the UN system and the custodian of the Sendai framework, have a responsibility to ensure that climate processes benefit from DRR implementation and practices. One of the key offers that we have is in context of the data we hold. 110 countries have benefited so far from our support in context of calculating their losses and damages in most contexts at the localized scales in different countries, and building on these 30 years of experience of this database having been in existence, we are now partnering with WMO and UNDP to develop a new tracking system for hazardous events and losses and damages, which will be very helpful to the loss and damage funding discussions. Our firm belief is that if countries cannot quantify their losses, they cannot monetize it. And if they cannot monetize it, loss and damage funding discussion will be further disrupted. And hence this data remains in the public domain, being officially collected by countries, and should be put to use in the context of loss and damage. Similarly, in the context of Sendai Framework Monitoring, we talked about the use of these metrics, indicators, targets, and data in the context of the global goal on adaptation. These indicators and targets are currently being reported by 156 countries. And thankfully, reducing the reporting burden of countries is a key priority for us. And hence, the SDG, especially 1, 11, and 13, benefit from Sendai framework targets and indicators. So the countries do not have to report twice for SDGs and Sendai, but we serve as the custodian of those SDG indicators, which is also the case with Samoa Pathway and the New Urban Agenda, and we should also be considered in the context of global goal on adaptation. I talked about a comprehensive approach. Without going too much into the details, we have been working with partners to ensure that national adaptation planning and disaster risk reduction planning are aligned to the extent possible in a country. And ideally, a country should have one country, one plan approach, considering there are so huge overlaps between the actions under adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So we have been supporting over 20 countries so far in terms of doing this, and we would want to scale it up further so that countries benefit from climate and disaster resources for the same action in the same country. We are doing it at the national level, but also at the local level through a Making Cities Resilient program, which has been in operation for the last 12 years now. And we have been ensuring that local governments benefit from this process. What does it mean in practical sense? For example, nature-based solution is a very good example of how adaptation and disaster risk reduction can work together in context of adapting to the climate change, but at the same time working as protective mechanism. Mangrove forest, for example, is a very good example of integrated approaches. Similarly, early warnings for all is one of the initiatives we have been co-leading with WMO. It was launched last year. This year, you will see that we will be launching another report on the progress on the global status of early warning system, just as we did the last year. We will be launching this report at COP28. And again, early warning system is another mechanism through which adaptive actions and risk reducing measures can come together. We work through a series of stakeholders. These are some of the examples of how different stakeholder groups have coordinated themselves and aligned themselves across common agendas. And if we are serious about inclusiveness, we would enhance their leadership in running many of these agenda items. Very quickly, in terms of how we want to move forward towards COP28 from our side, we will be following very closely many of these intergovernmental negotiation elements. Santiago Network, for example, we have proposed to host the Secretariat of the Santiago Network, co-leading with UNOPS, and including with technical support from organizations like IOM, UNDP, FAO, ICAD, and IID. We continue to support the Loss and Damage Fund, including through a staff secondment from our office to the Technical Support Unit. We are active in the Warsaw International Mechanism, including on the Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management. We continue to support the NAP process through LDC Expert Group. And I already mentioned about the GGA and GST. So those will be some of the key UNFCCC agenda items that we will continue to focus on. Our key focus areas this year at the COP28 would be early warnings for all, support to the loss and damage funding, and then in context of the GST, GGA, and comprehensive risk management through MECR, some of the key focus areas for our work. These are some of the key networks and alliances that we are working very closely with in context of the different items, and we would ensure that we will continue working in collaboration with them to enhance this agenda. So keep a watch on some of the forthcoming events and publications. We will be launching a guidance on applying climate information, which is a series of our CRM products. On 12th of June, we are hosting an event on the sideline of the subsidiary body meetings, where we will try to bring together the GST processes and the MTR from SDG Framework processes together as a kind of trying to draw the synergy between the two. So that's an event we're organizing on 12th of June, where we will also launch a leadership program on climate and DRR synergy. And then I already mentioned about the status report on early warning systems. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions and further discussions, but back to you, Katherine.
Thank you so very much, Animesh, for that very, very interesting presentation. Opportunities and synergies available for the two agendas. That's extremely interesting. I'd like to open the floor now, pass the floor, sorry, to Manuel Marques Pereira, who is the head of the Migration, Environment, Climate Change and Risk Reduction Division in the International Organization for Migration. Manuel, are you with us? Thank you. Welcome.
Yes, I am. My pleasure. I'm actually in Bonn to join Animesh tomorrow for the Transitional Committee meeting, and it's a pleasure talking to you following Animesh's words. I am and IOM is a great supporter of UNDRR, and we subscribe to the entirety of what was presented. I would take the liberty to add a few points that complement this conversation, and it's about the comprehensive notion on how DRR contributes to the broad spectrum of the issues related with the impacts of climate change. The prevention, I think that was very well covered. There has to be more efforts to help communities adapt what is to come, but also to build their resilience, to be able to cope better and have less loss and damage and keep reaping the benefits of social economical development. That should be a pillar of all our actions. There has to be also a significant attention to humanitarian action. It needs to be more effective. DRR can contribute, or the logic of DRR can contribute for humanitarian action to be much more efficient. And when we are discussing solutions to the impacts of climate change, we need to factor in new risks. The future is no longer acceptable to think on addressing crises without thinking on how this crisis, or at least these locations and communities, will be a few years down the line with the impacts of climate. This is an essence of what the IPCC report points on climate resilient development. If we are fostering development, it needs to be resilient to the true nature of the scenarios that these communities will see in the future. And with this integrated way, we will be able to use disaster risk reduction to save lives and to create also the possibility of choice, right? People, and at least from the perspective of IOM, in the near future will need to be able to have the right to choose about their mobility. We will arrive to places in the world, situations that will demand people to make a choice if they should stay or if they should move based on their own needs, based on their own capacities and conditions. Of course, there will be extremes where the unviability of the ecosystem will demand a planned relocation, so people purposely in group moving to another location. So these two elements involve a better understanding of how reducing risk translates in better adaptation and in better choices. And finally, just to summarize a point, I think that specifically for the MENA region, we also need to look at how climate will impact humanitarian settings, places where crises already exist and people living in crisis will need a reinforced attention in what disaster risk reduction can do to improve their living conditions. The quality of shelters, the availability of water and sanitation, the availability of livelihoods and food security in many humanitarian settings will be even more challenged by the impacts of climate change. So we will need to make sure that these already vulnerable communities can, through disaster risk reduction, be better prepared to face what is to come. And at least in this regard, we will have a bit of advantage about what is to come in our direction. And of course, I'm open to questions, but I think I should hand over the word so that I don't monopolize too much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuel. Thank you for your reflections there. I'm very pleased now to invite Sara Ahmed, the Finance Advisor from the Secretariat of the Vulnerable 20, to bring a different perspective to the conversation. Sara, over to you. Sara, I'm having difficulty hearing you.
Just checking if you can hear me.
Yes, you're okay now.
Okay.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So greetings, everyone, from Sharm el-Sheikh in the margins of the African Development Bank annual meetings, and thank you for the invitation. So just hearing the presentation and reflection also from the colleague from IOM, it's clear that options matter and expanding the toolkit matters as well, just because a lot of what we will be facing and are facing as well on the front line, we don't necessarily have the toolkit or the right composition of tools already available to deal with these intensifying risk in terms of not just intensity, but also frequency. So with that, I'd like to share a little bit of perspective from the V20 in terms of some of the solutions they're looking at, as well as some of the context. So if we go to the next slide, the V20 is composed of 58 climate vulnerable countries, representing 1.5 billion people. In terms of the context on loss and damage and debt, currently the V20's debt service payment is $552 billion, and over the last 2 decades has lost $500 billion. And as we know, as disaster strikes countries, communities, they're forced to borrow to replace the infrastructure, the home, the job that was lost. And as we are on track to breach 1.5C this decade, we would likely lose about 99% of our coral reefs. And if we stick to 1.5 this decade, we will lose around 90% of coral reefs. This has huge implications when it comes to food security, the fisheries industry, and everything relating to that. So as the debt crisis is underway and is perpetuated by climate chaos, it's critical to transform economies this decade. And so in April, in the World Bank IMF spring meetings, the V20 shared the Accra Marrakesh agenda, which calls for deep reforms, including around the establishment of anticipatory finance for the inevitable climate shocks and its spillover effects. And if we jump to the next slide, I'll show that there has been work on this with the G7 and the V20 collaborating to improve the architecture around financial protection. And this specifically includes prearranged and trigger-based funds and financing. Much of the work today has been small in scale, and it hasn't necessarily been coordinated in terms of programs and financing options, but this can all change as we hear from these actors and all of these collaborative platforms that are now available. That there's a way to perhaps cooperate more effectively and efficiently to have predictable sources of financing at various levels. And if we go to the next slide, it just shows a bit of what was done in terms of the launch of the shield. And then if we run to the next slide, it shows some of the protection packages. So I want to show this slide because it shows just the types of solutions that are on the table currently, and that there's a lot more of work we can do in terms of innovating, making these more fit for purpose, and also making it more accessible. There's discussions around premium support. The V20 and the G20 collectively endorse the SMART principles for premium support, for risk transfer solutions. And then there's natural disaster clauses for debt payment and suspension or relief, debt payment suspension or relief. So there's a whole lot of prearranged contingency funds and mechanisms that one can use. And it just has to be, one, made available, and two, working collaboratively with one another. And if we run to the next slide, it's clear that there has been a lot of innovation in countries with natural disaster management organizations, government providing budget, already compulsory flood insurance, agriculture insurance. And if we run to what we need to do is that we need to shift focus. Sorry, just going back to the slide. We need to shift focus as well to ensure that we can have more anticipatory funds. So this means forecast-based financing, so the funds can be made available ahead of time. Could we have shock-resilient loans for infrastructure to ensure that countries don't pile on the debt as disasters strike? Can we have better data and models to catalyze local markets? Because we have to grow the protection markets to deal with these climate risks. And if we run just to the next slide, I just have a couple of more to just show a little bit of examples over to the CVF loss and damage funding program. If we run to the next. So a colleague from IOM is here. We're collaborating with IOM on figuring out ways where we could make financing available for such risks. And that point on choice is really important because one, it's about making sure that decisions are made not in a point of weakness, but rather strength, so that it's easier to recover as well, and that it can perhaps be more positive. So, can we think of ways and can we work on ways where we could build better systems as a result of the climate crisis we are in? And if we go to the next slide, just want to focus in on loss and damage. This is a key thing, discussion and critical component of what a lot of funds are going to. It's creeping in ways we've never really seen or recognized, both in the macroeconomy and in livelihoods. And so the V20 is pioneering a loss and damage funding program to show the different channels to drive resources to vulnerable communities to address loss and damage. And so we're designing this to include eligible costs, a release mechanism, and that we hope we can share this with everybody to show just how we could design such things and perhaps to take learnings. So there are 4 key elements. One is around community infrastructure. The second is private assets, including livelihood assets, livelihood replacement as well. The third component is on coral reef restoration, and the fourth is on adaptation, because it may be that we don't want to build the same thing the same. And it also includes livelihood diversification, because that's what's really required, as many livelihood opportunities are becoming more risky or maybe non-existent in the future. And if we go to the next slide, these are just ways in which, this is just some of the funding of the loss and damage funding program out of the V20. It's mostly by non-state actors, as well as the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, around the adaptation component. And if we go to the next slide, some of the financing options are here. I mean, I think we have to expand the way we're thinking about where these resources can come from as well, just because the amount that we require is quite huge. I think the high-level group, the Stern report from the last COP came out with, we may need around $200 to $300 billion of LND resources. And this is in addition to the adaptation resources required and other things. So we need to try to build these markets, these systems, these tools to make it more systematic and accessible. So I'll stop there and back to you, Katherine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your reflection, Sara. It's really welcome to also engage with a non-United Nations perspective as well on this topic. I think it's really interesting that we've heard from our panelists and our lead presentation on expanding our thinking, but also linking to existing toolkits that are available to us and ensuring that we're maximising what's already out there, factoring new risks and looking towards the future for these vulnerable communities. I note a question in the chat. How will early warning support vulnerable communities adapt? If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat as well. And I'd like to hand over, we'll invite one question that we have now from Hisham, and then I'll pass back to Animesh for his reflections. Hisham. Hisham Abdulghani, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was off. My congratulations to my colleague for the excellent presentations. And if we look over the last 50 years, we will look to the trend on the mortality rate and also for the economic loss due to the extreme event, particularly the extreme weather event. We'll find there is an increase in the economic loss while there is a reduction in the loss of life. This is give us impression on the severity and the frequency, intensity of the extreme event becomes more, but also give us that due to the early warning system, we are really see some improvement and less for the mortality rate happening. This is actually to stress the criticality of the early warning system, as Animesh indicated in one of his slides, and considering the UNFCCC Secretary General initiative on the early warning system for all. I would like to stress on the importance of this initiative because it's the pre-action before or the pre-disaster action, which is really helping to save a lot of life if we have an effective, particularly we have more than 50% of the world population is not covered by early warning system. So I am really supporting this initiative so much, and I am really supporting the interaction between WMO, IFRC, UNDRR, and ITU on this initiative. and we expected good result over the coming 5 years as indicated by the Secretary General of the UN. Thank you so much.
Hisham, thank you so much for your comments. Animesh, perhaps over to you for your reflections.
Katherine, and am I audible? Because I see I'm myself muted. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Katherine, and thanks, Hisham. And also, I think the question from Raidan is also very relevant in this context. In our report that we released last year, which was the first report on the global status on early warning system, and also then we saw we are preparing the next report that will be launched at the COP28. One of the key findings is that, of course, there is this overall headline figure that half of the world is covered through an early warning system, but perhaps we need to get deeper into that. We did further analysis and we saw that the countries that have better level of early warning system in terms of their coverage and outreach have 8 times lower mortality than countries which have lower levels of early warning system. And that goes on to show that how far we have progressed and how far early warning systems are effective in saving lives. From the point of initial days of disaster risk reduction, say 2005 onwards, if I do a calculation of mortality reduction, the per 100,000 mortality has reduced from 1.84 to 0.86. So almost half of the number are getting people are getting are dying because of disasters today compared to 2 decades back. Again, if we took anecdotal evidence of early warning system, let's take the example of Bay of Bengal, where a super cyclone in 1999 killed 10,000 people or more, and then a cyclone of the same intensity in 2019, 20 years later, killed less than 100 people or less. Goes on to show that early warning systems do play a very big role. But that brings us to the question or the point that Raidan is raising in terms of what does it mean at the community level. We know that the early warning system works as a chain, and this chain is only as strong as the weakest link. And often that weakest link is found to be at the community level. It seems that we have done very well in collecting the information, having the right infrastructure, and to a great extent also having the right dissemination mechanism for early warning. But the last mile outreach of early warning to the communities who will take self-preemptive action still remains a weakness in early warning systems. And this is something which we really need to fill a gap in terms of ensuring that no matter how strong we make an early warning system, if a community member does not know what action to take in the context of early warning, the whole system becomes meaningless. So perhaps Manuel can also come in context of what does it mean from the displacement point of view, because of also the matrix that IOM has been working on, but also to the link of early warning to early action and anticipatory action. Maybe Sara can also talk a bit about it, because perhaps the focus of Global Shield on financial protection is often would be strongly linked with anticipatory action, which will be triggered through an early warning mechanism at the community level. So perhaps maybe Manuel and Sara could also come in on these points.
Might I add, please, colleagues, please also note the additional question that's in the chat when you provide your reflections. Manuel, over to you.
Thank you. I think this is a very relevant point in terms of displacement. As Animesh said, what I usually call the pendular displacement, which is displacement between areas of origin, a safe place, and the return, is a very important life-saving mechanism that needs to be a very well-oiled machine. But there are other complementary activities that need to become with these. You know, the safeguard of legal identity documents. People need to know that if the warning is coming, they need to safeguard their valuables, their documentation, so that they can be part of what the state and the social contract can then offer them in terms of response. But at the same time, it's this movement back and forth in the engagement with the government and the government structures that can open the doors for people to receive the resources for having a safe reconstruction and being safe. And this is a process that takes time, that goes from governments having the capacity to do forecasts, to have better information on weather, translating that through a machine into effective and practical actions. And I think this, in the years to come, will be extremely important in some of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, and also in displacement settings. I see the question on how the integration of these two things with the Secretary General agenda is critical, right? The only way to ensure safety for people already in displacement is to make sure early warnings arrive to them. And the only way to make sure that less people need to be in protracted displacement is create early warning systems so that they are informed and help them today mitigate and reduce the risk of ending up in displacement. So it's a cycle that we all need to contribute and make sure that people are safe and informed. Again, the right to choose about mobility is a right that we need to start claiming. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Manuel. And Sara, I'd be very interested in your reflections as well. On behalf of the vulnerable 20, the 20 are not all the same. And when we're talking about communities, they're also not the same. And there's an element of localization that needs to come into play here when it comes to early warning. So Sara, over to you.
Hello, Katherine. Sara is currently having connection issues. She's trying to reconnect though. Thank you.
No problem at all. We have another question here from Echo in the chat. Animesh and Manuel, perhaps. What are the main challenges identified by the presenters for those synergies and for a sector alliance for the benefit of the impacted and vulnerable communities? Animesh.
Yeah, so we understand fully that the real synergy and real action in terms of the coherence will take place at the level of implementation. And the implementation level happens either at the sectoral level and more so at the level of the communities when the real work starts taking shape. And what we are trying to do to ensure that the approach we are following in terms of the synergies between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, we're trying to extend it further into the sectors, collaborating with different partners. So as of now, for example, we have developed a series of guidance and toolkits and providing technical assistance to countries in terms of developing integrated plans, building on the good examples we already mentioned about, for example, in the Pacific. But then we are also working closely with, for example, with FAO on developing a CRM, a comprehensive risk management for the food systems. And this is a commitment we actually made at the Food System Summit. Similarly, we have just developed a process to integrate this into the health sector, partnering with WHO, and then partnering with a series of other organizations to do the same in the environment sector using nature-based solution as a key approach. So as soon as I think we get into the sector, each of the sector will have specific elements of coherence, and it's very important that the basis of coherence will be actions to ensure that we strengthen adaptive capacity of communities and sectors. At the same time, the actions themselves take care of risk reduction measures as well. What is the bottom line for all of these is that the developmental actions by the sectors should be risk informed. And why risk informed? Because we have reached a stage where an event-centric way of managing disaster is a thing which is very conventional, which is important. Events are happening and we need to respond to them and recover from them. But we should also not get into a spiral of disaster where event becomes the key focus and we either can prepare for it or respond to it. We can also, through our own actions, integrate risk into the very DNA of development so that poor development processes do not create risk for the future. If that does not happen, we will keep doing development in a way that will create risk for the future, and then we will do disaster management. And that's not a very sustainable way of working. We should ensure that developmental processes themselves take care of the risk, and over time, development and disaster risk reduction move in the same direction and not away from each other. There's also a question in context of what Nick Bishop has asked in terms of how these all come together in the context of loss and damage agenda, as well as the tracking system that I mentioned. So one of the key benefits of having loss and damage tracking in multiple contexts, but let me take the example of early warning system. There are two things that any successful early warning systems would need to know. One, which hazards to monitor to trigger an early warning, and two, over a period of time to know, are we successful or not? And the disaster loss and damage tracking system provide these two information. It tells in a specific village or a specific ward or a specific district that which are the key hazards that have been happening or taking shape in this specific area of work, and hence it contextualizes early warning. And then over a period of time, it will tell whether losses and damages are declining or increasing. If they're declining, we are doing well. If they're increasing, we're not doing well. And this is very important both in context of not just early warning system, but if I project it at a global level, also in context of global goal and adaptation. We should not be seeing adaptation and loss and damage as two different agendas. The success or failure of adaptive actions should be seen from the lens of increase or decrease of loss and damage. And this is something, a paradigm shift that we will have to transcend if we are serious about adaptive actions. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Animesh. And Manuel, I'd like to hand over to you and also ask perhaps for your reflections. We have a question in the chat regarding climate change, the impact of climate change in fragile and conflict affected settings, which obviously has a displacement angle to it as well.
Thank you. I fully subscribe what Animesh has said, so I won't enter on that. I would just complement that one of the synergies that need to be built in is that preparedness is not just about having plastic sheeting and humanitarian materials to deliver, is also bringing people into this system, and early warnings is a vehicle to listen to individuals that may be affected and look at their capacities and the resources they can put in the table and share that and make them part of the solution, right? Because people that are informed and part of the solution will then help shape a more effective humanitarian response. In relation to the issues on climate change and conflict, I think that is a dimension that more and more we will see. But if we look into the root of conflicts, we will most probably, in the majority of the cases, found an issue of dispute of resources. Irrespective of what is the resource, the critical point is how climate change will impact further that resource and how solutions to mitigate the dispute for that resource need to be found in ways to adapt to these transformations. The access of water, the access to grazing areas, desertification, and the disappearance of pasture for nomadic populations that then move in conflict with agriculture, with farmer populations. So these are the dimensions between the biosystem, the climates that are to come, the climate change that is to come, and how disaster risk reduction can make the bridge between the two to attenuate these disputes of resources. I think we need much more attention to it. We can, for example, look at the question that I was saying, Somalia. It's an issue of water management, an issue of resources for livestock and the viability of livestock to those communities. But if the El Nino come and there may be floods in the next coming weeks, is an excess of water. Again, is the management of the resource, water, that constitutes the main challenge to have peace and a sustaining situation for those communities. Over.
Thank you so much for that, Manuel. I'm just I'm wondering if Sara has rejoined or if she's only in the chat. Sara, are you there?
She sent a message that she cannot connect, but I see somebody from the V20 Secretariat is there in the among the participants. Alex.
Hello. Sorry, I was on mute. Sara is connected, but is not a presenter. She's trying to join. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I lost a network connection, but I'm just calling in from my phone. I think I missed the question.
Sara, I think at this stage we're sort of final reflections from each of our panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Just a final reflection here is that it's clear that looking at the example of early warning systems is how do we then bring in the composition of resources and tools and financing in order to ensure that we could limit damages to the economy, communities, and the economy as a whole. And so With that, through the Global Shield and the Loss and Damage Funding Program of the V20, we look forward to trying to work with everyone here on how we could better use a lot of what we have today and expand it in order to deliver financing ahead of time to where it's needed the most. So thanks so much for inviting me to this.
Sara, thank you so much. I would note there are some interesting comments also in the chat and reflections for our panelists and for colleagues to reflect on. We are expecting some closing remarks from Dr. Youssef Nassef, who's joining us from the UNFCCC, who's just a few minutes away. So Animesh, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Katherine. I think I would want to pick up some of the points in context of community engagement, vulnerability across in the community itself, and the connect between climate change and conflict. I mean, this is something which is becoming so strong in fragile context, especially in different parts in Africa, for example, in Horn of Africa and so on. I remember a few years ago, there was a study done in Africa that found that every 1 centimeter increase in rainfall reduces the possibility of a serious conflict by 6%. Goes on to show that link between climate change resulting hazards in a community and often resulting in conflict is one-to-one at times, because often the climate conflicts are not just an issue of civil protection, it's also an issue of climate change, and hence the issue of human security, climate security come together in those contexts. It's needless to say that the most vulnerable communities are the ones who have least access to resources, and hence the fight is often over resources. But within the communities, it's the women, children, and persons with disabilities that are the people who need to have specific focus. This is something which we are trying to ensure, and hence Red Cross is a core member of the Early Warnings for All initiative as well, to ensure the community outreach takes care of these intersectional approaches to ensure that it's just not about disseminating early warning systems, but to ensure that each and every member of that community, acknowledging their specific vulnerabilities, take appropriate action when the early warning is ensured, but also in the context of long-term resilience as well.
Thank you so much for those final remarks, Animesh, and for your time and UNDRR's leadership in the webinar today. I'm very pleased to see Dr. Youssef Nassef, who's the Director of the Adaptation Division at the UNFCCC Secretariat. Dr. Youssef, lovely to see you again. Thank you for joining us. And over to you for some closing thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, and apologies I couldn't contribute earlier. But I've got some sort of a summary of what was being discussed from Animesh as we were going forward, and I think just to give a perspective on where we are and where we're moving, especially since as we speak here, there's a transitional committee meeting for loss and damage funding that's going on. Today's the sort of the pre-meeting for members. Tomorrow and the day after will be the actual formal second meeting of the transitional committee, and so things are moving fast. And just to remind where we were and where we have been, just to show that even though we're not where we should be, we have actually advanced a lot over the past couple of decades. The process, the climate change negotiation process, has been focused predominantly on supporting planned adaptation. So we have very well developed mechanisms there. We have funding streams, mandatory funding streams for national adaptation plans, both for the formulation and the implementation of the priority projects that come through these plans. But we've never had any mandate to support countries after a disaster strikes or after any risk materializes. And almost 10 years ago, we got sort of that first submission from the small island states proposing a three-tiered mechanism to address loss and damage, which came at the heels of a huge paper that we were asked to do on financial risk management. And it was very clear from that paper that there were blind sites, and it sort of resurrected the ideas from an insurance proposal from a couple of decades before, which was more of a sort of a polluter pays arrangement to compensate for sea level rise. And so the first step there, since this was almost a taboo subject because of its potential link to compensation, was to start a knowledge building exercise. So we have this Warsaw International Mechanism and an executive committee that looks at it. The executive committee looked at 5 different areas. There's comprehensive risk management, there's human mobility, there is non-economic losses, and there is slow onset events, and there was a 5th one on action and support, which was always the one that was a bit more complicated. And with time, this evolved into creating a mechanism for technical support. So finally, direct support to countries. What technical capacity building or support do countries need to be able to assess and respond to loss and damage? So that's called the Santiago Network. And this year, there will be a choice of host to take over from the UNFCCC Secretariat the running of this Santiago Network and the provision of support for technical capacity building. And then in Sharm el-Sheikh, we went through this other phase where finally we have a mechanism to potentially disperse finance to address loss and damage. So there's 2 things in it, a fund, a dedicated fund, and funding arrangements. And then there's a bigger picture of the existing mosaic of funding and how to address complementarity among all of these. And the critical question here is, where is the exact gap? Because there are gaps in current support systems, but maybe there are also gaps in modalities that have to be invented. Things to enable immediate disbursement, for example. You don't wait 6 months or 3 years or whatever. You know, financial mechanism has procedures that can prolong the time between the need expressed and the actual disbursement. But when we deal with loss and damage, and it's a matter of life and death, some of the existing modalities within our financial mechanism are not really usable. So all these questions are being addressed now. But then when you zoom out a bit, we mentioned we have planned adaptation, and basically loss and damage is reactive adaptation when you come to the responding part. There's an anticipatory part with sort of the averting and minimizing loss and damage, but the focus now in finance is on the responding. So what happens after the losses materialize? And there's a bit of an optimization that eventually we'll have to look at, and there are people helping with number crunching on this, where at any point in time, even if massive resources are available, no country would reduce its risk to 0. So there's some risk that's retained. You address it through insurance, you address it through planned relocation, etc., through some prudent optimization between preemptive action and contingent or reactive action. And that we still haven't addressed this sufficiently. There's a lot of thinking going into it. We have a comfort zone of being able to operate within scarcity. So we say, okay, there's not much available. So first we make sure that sufficient resources are available, and then let's see how to optimize this. But eventually we reach that stage as to what's the amount of risk reduction that needs to be done prudently and in an economically efficient way, and to ensure that all intolerable losses are eliminated, versus what can be retained to be addressed through loss and damage action, which then gets transformed into part of the portfolio of action, not just a manifestation of failure or something because we've acted too late or because there's not enough resources, but actually as part of your planning process. And that takes us to the change in paradigm between thinking, as we have been doing in the past, of extreme events as individual separate events and then responding to it in a way that returns us to the status quo, versus the new thinking now with climate change on top, where we actually look at this as a trend and not as individual events that need to be taken care of, and not trying to return to the status quo, to the previous state, but actually building forward better. So we return or go forward to a state which is more sustainable, which protects us in the future, and which is also consistent with the country's aspirations as we move forward. So this is where we are now. This is where we're heading, and I'm very happy that that this meeting took place with this exchange, and to have had this wonderful opportunity to address you at the end of it. So thank you very much, and back to you, Katherine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nassef. Really, thank you for making the time. We all know how busy you are, particularly at the moment, pre-Bonn conference. I'd like to thank our speakers, panelists today, UNDRR, UNFCCC, the Secretariat of the Vulnerable 20, and of course IOM. Thank you so much for your time. Please join us next week. Same time, we'll be discussing the impact of climate change on small island developing states. Take care, bye.
Thanks everyone, bye-bye.